Surviving the Survivor.
This Sunday will mark 4 weeks since the absolutely savage and brutal quadruple murder of the 4 University of Idaho students. Still no suspects have been named and no murder weapon in sight. We're going to break this all down, and you guys are in for a treat. We've got an amazing panel of 3 all-stars. One of them, a legend in her own right. You're looking at Ann Burgess. She is an internationally recognized pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse, and the author of A Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Among her many awards and accolades in 2016, she was named a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing. This resume, I could go on for 3 days. She also worked with the FBI Academy special agents to study serial offenders and the links between child abuse, juvenile delinquency, and subsequent perpetration. You know the super successful Netflix show Mindhunters, about the FBI's first day of criminal profiling. She worked with the real life agents that show is based on, and unlike my cardboard cutout mother here, Carmela, who is not in person and who has a few years on you, Mom, is out here working diligently. My mother said she needed the night off. Next up, we've got Dr. Gary Brucato, a Columbia University clinical psychologist, researcher, and author in the areas of early psychosis, violence, and other serious psychopathology. He studies, among other things, how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic versus non-psychotic persons. That's an important thing to know when you're looking for a killer. He is the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. And the handsome man in the bottom corner with a clean-cut haircut is Jeff Wood, retired FBI out of Boston. He gets the shortest bio because I just found out that he was joining us. Welcome to one and all. Thank you, guys and women.
I'll just jump in and mention that I'm no longer with Columbia. I'm now in private practice and affiliated with Boston College, where Ann is as a visiting scholar. So it's only right to say that I have transitioned out of there.
Beautiful. Well, we love Boston College. I went to Brandeis. It's all in the same neighborhood. So welcome. Just a quick programming note, Patreon, please support us on there. We are getting a lot of people joining. You get ad-free content, you get behind the scenes footage. And this January 5th, you're getting a live meet and greet with this woman. You can talk about the Holocaust, fun stuff like that, serial killers, more fun stuff, or you can ask her anything. She's also a licensed therapist. Before we get going, I like to do this on the show. Just want to remember all the victims in this case. Sometimes this stuff becomes a whodunit. We forget that they're actually real people. So we've got Madison Mogen, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20 years old. Let's all remember them. So as far as we know, not a ton of new updates coming from police outside of the fact that they are now redirecting the tip line directly to the FBI because they're getting so many tips about this Hyundai Elantra that they put a bulletin out for yesterday. It's a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra, which investigators say they believe the occupants of this vehicle may have critical information to share regarding this case. First to the legend, Ann. How big a deal is this that police are finally putting out a possible suspect vehicle?
Well, a car is certainly a good piece of evidence, if indeed it turns out to be, because they can trace it down. There are all kinds of ways that they can work that. And police are very good, or law enforcement, at cars. I remember working with the behavioral science unit agents that they would almost be able to profile your car from looking at one of the suspects. So that's, I think, I think it's good that they've got that, if indeed it turns out to be productive.
Now, as with these high profile cases in this new world of social media, everyone is a cyber sleuth. I saw someone just posted, there's body cam footage of a police officer arriving on scene, and you see a white car in the distance. Jeff, you're the FBI, former FBI agent, and I don't know if you saw this. As the officer is approaching the home, you suddenly see the white car's headlights turn off. Anything to read into this? Have you seen that video?
I unfortunately have not seen the video. I would like to see the video. It's one of those situations here where he's probably going to take quick note of the car, but he's being called to the house, and that's going to be where the threat is for him, right? What's going on inside the house. He's going to keep his situational awareness of what is going on all around him, but he needs to get to the house and find out what's going on in the house, not only for his safety, but for the safety of anyone still in the house. And is there someone still a threat in that house? And that's where his main focus will be. So he's going to take note of everything, but his focus will be on the house initially, because that's where the call was to go and respond.
Gary, you wrote a book called, co-authored a book called The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. I mean, if you can break it down, how do you think these violent crimes have evolved? And if you had how would you paint the portrait potentially of this killer or killers in Idaho?
Well, this is you're opening up a whole can of worms with this question, because the point of that book is really twofold. The first half of it is to talk about the idea that there's a very wide spectrum of motives for committing crimes, which I must say in earlier generations stuck lower to the lower in the scale on average. And you're saying a lot more of the higher up stuff on the scale, which takes a lot more change in personality, audacity, narcissism, sadism, cruelty, things like that. I swear, if you use that scale as like a thermometer of how a culture is doing, the culture is getting worse. But I would say that the point of the first half of that book is the idea that there are many people that would commit very heinous acts because of situational factors that they would not repeat, because it is not really an integral part of their personality to do it. It's happening out of circumstance, desperation, the particular relationship they're in, trauma, whatever. But then as you move up the scale, you start to move through different degrees of narcissism, then into psychopathy, and then into sadism. You start to see the personality really figures into the motive, so that then the crimes don't make as much sense, because you can't say, well, there's a clear discernible motive here beyond some thing that just must be in the person's fantasies. Like, for example, in this Idaho case, there's no overt sexual assault. So then you say, well, what would be the point of doing this? Well, there must be a point. Most people don't just do things for no reason, except for that small fraction of people who do things like this because they're profoundly disturbed or on drugs or alcohol. So that the question is, what would the motive be? And what makes that a little tricky when we look at modern crime, particularly since the 1960s in the Western world, is that a lot of things are an expression of sexual frustration, an outlet for sexual frustration, whether it's overt or not overt. And Ann, for example, was one of the people who really helped to elucidate that sex crimes don't have to necessarily involve overtly sexual things, that a person can express those frustrations in butchery or mutilation without any real clear indication. And then the second half of that book is really just to get into the idea that there are crimes that couldn't happen in previous generations because the technology didn't exist, like the internet or the microwave, for example, which was used for murder almost immediately upon its invention, right, to kill an infant. As soon as something is invented, someone uses it in a new way, right? The metaverse, Ann and I, is something we've been talking about recently. It's pretty much a matter of time until it's used for crime, right? People do that. But there are also new evil in the sense that some crimes involve cultural disinhibition, changes in what people will permit and tolerate, so that as the culture changes, the likelihood of these more audacious crimes increases. As a matter of fact, this Ohio crime is awful, but one hates to admit that you could look at the front page of the newspaper over the course of a year, and it almost starts to become a common kind of story to hear these kinds of things. But 60 years ago, it would have been like the crime of the century.
Yeah, I think you said Ohio, but I think you meant Idaho.
Idaho. Excuse me, Idaho. Yes, it becomes like it would have been the crime of the century. Now it's and what I will also add, because I think we're going to wind up revisiting in this conversation, is that I and a colleague, Rocky Gurgis at Columbia, were the co-creators of the Columbia Mass Murder Database, that's the largest database of mass murder to our knowledge, ever compiled. And this is a mass murder. This Idaho case is a mass murder. And I think we really have to understand it from that perspective. Although it has a lot of qualities of like a lot of other offenses that it's tempting to get into, I think we really have to understand that this is somebody who committed a mass murder, right? Which according to some definitions is 3 or more victims in the same place, same time. And other definitions is 4 people in the same place at the same time or more. By either definition, we're looking at a mass murder. So just to put those things out there, but I think this is really going to come down to motive, and I bet it's a decidedly modern one.
Sadly, we are the world capital of mass murders, unfortunately. And to you, the legend of the panel. I spoke to a Navy SEAL who's also a former FBI special agent, and he said he didn't think it was a rage killing. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of what his take was a little deeper into this show. He does not think it's a rage killing. Do you, and how are you profiling this killer from the information that you've gathered thus far?
Well, only have the information, of course, has been released to the public. And the important thing is, if he's thinking rage in terms of what would also be considered overkill, that far more injury to each victim than was necessary to kill the victim. If that's a definition, that would be important to know, because we don't know. We still have not seen autopsy reports, which will have the number of stab wounds, et cetera, and more importantly, what part of the body. Is this more contained to the face and the neck and the chest, or is it other parts? So again, once that information comes out, we'll have a better lead on. But the issue of rage, just meaning over aggression to the bodies of these 4 young students, it still doesn't say motive. From that standpoint, that a knife was used, that's important. A knife, how many types of cases are knives used? I know in our study, we did have 1 mass murder, and that was Richard Speck out of Chicago back in the 60s, I think. And so he was one of our 36. And so I've been trying to look at that to see if there's any differences, any similarities, that kind of thing. But he used a variety of ways of killing the young students. But in this case, in your Idaho case, again, I'd like to wait a little bit to see how much injury to the victim and what location of the injury.
I'm going to get to Jeff about the crime scene in a moment, but Ann, Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, has been speaking quite a bit to the media. One of the things that he said was that the injuries, and I don't have the exact verbiage in front of me, that the injuries to his daughter, Kaylee, were more severe, more pronounced than to Maddie. Are you reading anything into that? When I spoke to this Navy SEAL, he said it could be that she was a target. It could be that they got to Maddie after the person got to Maddie afterwards and could have just been fatigued. This, without getting too macabre, this Navy SEAL was saying it is difficult to kill a person. It takes a lot of energy, especially with a knife. But what do you make about the fact that the father came out and said that the injuries to his daughter were worse?
Well, it would give you some, what the meaning of that would obviously be in the motive of the offender. If there was more, again, I want to know location to see where it is, what number she was in terms of being of the 4. I absolutely agree with the Navy SEAL that it takes a lot of strength to go to kill 4 young people, who some of them obviously could have woken up and resisted. We don't know that. But I think the other important thing is it was dark. Unless he turns lights on, it was dark. So he's doing this. Does he really know who is who, if you will? That would be important. And why he leaves the first 2 and goes to the next floor, the 3rd floor, and kills the others. Something, and that's where his daughter was. I think that is important. So that if he, there's been a lot in the media about targeting, and could it have been her that he was targeting? And so again, I think that's important information. And I would just keep that again with the understanding that the context that it's in. I just find a lot of the lights being off and who is he stabbing and how much does he even have? I think there's some talk that they can wear these lights in the dark that would shine on person, but that had to have been a very well planned type of crime.
Just to follow up on location, you're meaning the location of the stab wounds and
Yes.
So let's say it was the abdomen as opposed to the neck. What does that location tell you as someone that reads into the minds of these killers?
Well, I'm looking at more if they're at the neck and the chest. That is usually where you would see stab wounds. To the abdomen, that could just be that he's just not visualizing well where he's stabbing. That's going to be a less of a lethal weapon. You have fewer arteries in that area unless you get down to the thighs. So I think that, again, if there was so much blood from what they say, it's got to be probably more to the neck and the chest, which is very well planned. That to me says he's very well planned.
So Jeff, NBC News had an interesting report. They spoke to some former FBI agents such as yourself. And basically the gist of this story is one of these FBI agents says, look, it's going to take a long time. This is not like the TV show. It's not like CSI. And this agent went on to say, former agent went on to say, it's complicated by the chaotic nature of the murders, the layout of the rented house where the victims were found, the likelihood that many students hung out or partied there, collecting and processing hundreds of DNA samples, and then looking for a potential suspect or suspect's genetic profile could take weeks or months. Do you agree with that? And how difficult is it to process this crime scene?
I do agree with that. I was not a homicide investigator, but I spent my 20 years in the FBI conducting investigations targeting violent gang members. So I helped out in many instances after the fact where murder took place and helped out in different ways to help solve murders. But I do know that when you have a situation in this case where, yeah, you've got an apartment building, you're going to have a party, you're going to have friends over, so you're going to have people in and out of that place. So you're going to have fingerprints left there, DNA left there. So in this situation, when the murder takes place and you're going through that, you're collecting a whole lot of DNA, and now you're going to have to try and get comparisons to that DNA to develop a suspect. So it can take a long time. There's a lot of different techniques that the law enforcement can use. Now that you've got the state police helping out the town's police department, you've got the FBI, you have other federal agencies. So there's a lot of different techniques that can be brought into bear to help try and narrow down suspects, but it's still a painfully long process. And one thing that I've seen in my career, juries and the public look at our TV shows, look at our movies, and you solve a crime in an hour, you solve a crime in 2 hours in the movie, and they expect law enforcement to be able to solve these horrendous crimes that quickly and have it wrapped up nice and neat in a bow. And it doesn't even and there's a misconception sometimes of what we can gather from a crime scene. So, you may not have a fingerprint left there that's key. So let's say they did find a knife. The suspect's fingerprints may not be on the knife. And a jury may demand, hey, this is 2022, there should be fingerprints on the knife, just because maybe the person was wearing gloves. So no, there won't be fingerprints on the knife. So it makes it difficult. And one of the things that's great about our justice system is you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. We may be, I've done a lot of cases where an hour after murder, I knew who did it, but I would never have enough to make an arrest because I didn't have the information to pass on to the police that they had enough to say, I know. But just because I know, how do I can't say I know. I have to have evidence to show how I know. Does that make sense?
100%. And that is a very important distinction. You can't say I know, you got to prove it, and you got to prove it in a court of law. Gary, you're the PhD psychologist here. If you had to paint a portrait of this killer, is this guy a loner? Do you think it's someone that knew these young women and this young gentleman? Who is this guy in your estimation from what you've heard?
Well, I think we have to be very careful about speculating here until we have a lot more information and we have crime scene photos and autopsies and so forth. But I will say one thing that has been interesting to me about this case based on the mass murder work I've done is that in the Columbia database, what we showed very clearly is that the weapon is the key, because when firearms are used, it is statistically far less likely that the individual is dealing with any severe mental illness. When a weapon other than a firearm is used, anything at all other than a firearm, whether it's a knife crashing an airplane into the side of a mountain, bombs or explosives of any sort, bludgeoning, whatever, it becomes statistically more likely that the person is authentically troubled in a kind of psychotic or quasi-psychotic way. And if that is true, what it would imply is that the person would be somebody that would be off-putting to other people, not somebody that would be a slick, likable person, but somebody that would be rejected and odd to other people. Now, the possibility exists that this is an individual who may actually go on to be a serial killer, meaning that after a cooling off period, it happens again. It's about 11.78%, if my math is correct, if I remember. About 11.78% of people in the database were not considered pure mass murderers, because after a period of cooling off or following a period, the mass murder followed or was followed by killing again, right, at a separate time. So those people are serial killers, and there you can have all kinds of motivations, sexual frustrations, mission-oriented kind of, hostilities towards people, etc. Now, among these people who commit mass murder of this type, of the blade type, what you sort of see are people that either impulsively grab whatever is around them and kill an entire group of people, like cases that you sometimes see in China of mass murder. For some reason, it's a phenomenon that we encountered many times in the literature of, let's say, a very depressed, psychotic mother taking a blade to school and killing the children of other people because of the despair that she's experiencing. That kind of impulsive, quasi-psychotic or fully psychotic kind of emotional upset leading to mass murder with a knife, because that's what just happens to be there. But the other thing that you see are people where there is almost a kind of odd, what we would call schizoid, kind of psychotic-like detachment from, warm, normal human relations, and a kind of a paranoid detachment from people, and an individual that can feel very slighted and deeply, brood and feel kind of paranoid about rejection, particularly by women, or come to view certain kind of person. And that kind of individual tends to live a very mechanical, restricted existence, to be very drawn to things that are regimented and kind of and to have an explosive temper. And that kind of person, if they were to commit an act like this, the blade would be selected because of its intimacy with the victim, the cruelty of it, and the expression of all of that envy and rage and feeling, left out. And that kind of person, if that is what we're dealing with, that would be a person that would be considered an odd duck to other people. But you wouldn't want to mess with, because you'd feel that underneath the surface, they could really flip on you. And that kind of person would do something like check an area out for a long period of time and plan like they were going in like a hunting mission. The idea would be that the steps would all be very meticulously planned out. And the idea would be, today is the day. I'm going in, and this is what I'm going to do. And they're all going to pay. And then I'm going to leave, and I'm going to get away. And that kind of person won't leave traces. The impulsive kind does, because they weren't planning to do it. They just become completely emotionally overwhelmed. So you put all these pieces together. I think we're really speculating here, but my sense is that this is somebody that is going to be, when you find this person, if they do, they're going to see that this is somebody that people found peculiar at baseline. A little too cold, a little too regimented, a little bit too interested in things like, blades and weaponry and hunting and things like that, and who coolly, in a detached way, planned to express rage. And that is very different than a person who experiences rage impulsively. That's what it feels like to me. And there are mass murders like that, and they are especially cruel. And the only final thing I'll say about that kind of mass murder is that when they do it, usually there is a target, and everyone else is like basically collateral damage. So that there's that one individual who was honed in on as the object of fixation, and anyone else who has to take the blade is just because of their proximity, or because they sort of mentally remind the person too much of that individual, the person they're dating, the people they love, the whatever. It's just to kind of wipe them out. And you really, when this is where I think there's that very modern flavor to this kind of case, is I think you really want to understand that this, in many ways, is probably an expression of envy. Someone who is angry that other people are more accepted and more loved, more desirable, and more relaxed and comfortable socially. So that's the kind of person who would say, if I can't have it, why should you?
And there are the person that you're describing, there are a few odd characters that have popped up in this case. We'll get into a few of them in a few minutes, but and I wanted to
get answered your question. That was a long answer, but I hope that answered your question.
The thorough answer, as expected.
Could I add one thing, though?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, Jeff. Tell me what you think about that.
I completely agree with you on that level, but I would, again, this is coming from my gang experience and coming from my last case being MS-13 and dealing with the brutality of the MS-13 gang members. The 18th Street gang members were, initially founded as an American gang, but is now morphed into that Central American gang. And they brought that Central American third world type mentality to their business of being gang members. And they use bladed weapons. So everything you said, I would say for a American, a Western, European, Canadian, absolutely speaks true.
But we eliminate them, Jeff. We took them out of the database. People who were committing mass murder in the context of crime, like gang activity, were eliminated. It was personal cause only.
But I'm just saying, for a law enforcement perspective,
yes,
on a lower, I mean, it would not be my priority. I would not say that this is my number one lead type thing, but I would never rule out some type of criminal aspect. Like you don't, I don't want to, this isn't to say that there was any criminal activity committed by the victims here, but we have to say maybe they knew a criminal, who knows. But if you had a criminal who was a gang member, you wouldn't have necessarily that same mentality. It's just something I would keep down low on my lead board, or like, here are possible things. Just and so in that case, 99% of the time I'm with you. But what if you had that 1% chance where this is someone who, with the MS-13 gang, they love their knives and machetes and hacking people to death constantly. So for me as an investigator, I won't rule out anything until my evidence is pointing somewhere. So I just wanted to add that too.
I think it's a really important and smart point. And I think the reason that blades and things might be used is because the crime scene is also a message to would-be, talkers and witnesses and things like that. But otherwise, you'd imagine a very expeditious killing, like just shooting people. Because there was no reason to kill these people in this way if it wasn't to either send a message or to express a fantasy or play out something emotionally. Agreed. And that's why you have to say killing in ways other than expeditiously with a gun have a special cruelty that has to have a driver. And that's where I think the gang thing is interesting. But if it were a gang thing, Jeff, you tell me, this is your area, wouldn't it be more to send a message? That
it absolutely would. It would be to send a message. I mean, MS-13 did it because they're showing everyone this is our territory, and this is how we let everyone know that we're instilling fear into that community. So if this was somehow related to a gang or some kind of criminal activity, it's definitely working by sending a message that we're instilling fear right now because here we are. And, one thing, as you said too, the fact that, not all the times with a weapon, I mean, it can be close with a pistol or some kind of firearm, but when you're going to another weapon as a knife or your fists or a hammer, you're getting in close. It's becoming much more personal. You're going to have, there's distance, so maybe I won't get blood myself if I use a firearm. I forgot the right distance, but if I'm using a knife, that warm, sticky blood is going to be splattering on me, and it takes a different kind of person to be able to handle that kind of violence, that kind of when I'm committing that kind of violence onto somebody. So
that's exactly what our former FBI special agent Navy SEAL said yesterday. Because you're not really thinking when you're talking about this about the acrid smell of the blood and all that's involved in that, without getting too gruesome. But also, if I may humbly add, I think maybe demographics is a part of this as well. Moscow, Idaho, much different than Boston or Miami, where I am. Everyone out there is a hunter. A lot of people are carrying knives. Maybe that's part of it. And to you, do you think this killer has killed before, if you had to guess?
I think he has killed animals before. I have no doubt about that. Whether he has killed a human, I don't think so. I did want to say a few words about the victim, because my area is much more in the victim area. We don't have a lot of information, but the one tiny bit I could find is the agents would always profile from the risk level of the victim and the risk level of the offender. From the risk level of the victim, it would be very low if you just take the crime scene. They were in bed sleeping, whereas the risk level to the offender, it was not too high because it was night and the victims were sleeping, so he had a lot of control over them. However, two of the victims worked. I didn't get where they worked, but that would raise their kind of social status where other people knew them. So
I believe it was a Greek restaurant in town.
Okay, but at least other people would know them, when they go in for that. So that would be something to, if you're trying to look at the possibility that there's been some surveillance, some stalking, whatever, of the victims, that would increase the possibility. So were there certain people that outside maybe asked to have them as waitresses or something? I mean, that might be an area that they get into. Mm-hmm. The other point I wanted to make that we learned from the from the serial killer study is that some of these offenders, and maybe Gary or Jeff can comment on this, would go into these at night, would go into wherever the crime was going to be committed and get very, very familiar, go around the rooms, get very familiar with things and so forth. We've seen enough of that. So could there have been some of that going on ahead of time? We do know evidently that there had been it was a quote, a party house, but that evidently that night there was not a party that I have seen any information on. People came in afterwards, but not before. It sounds like they all came home. The other interesting point is, could he access that first floor where the other two students were, or would he have had to come in and go into the separate door? That would be interesting to know, whether he just omitted them, whether he got tired, whether he didn't know they were there. I mean, a number of things to look at. Those are just some of the other points I
think that's an excellent point, and that's a question that so many people I know online are raising about the two that survived. From what we know, I believe they were in the basement level, and I've actually had someone on the podcast whose husband lived in that very house 25 years ago when they were in law school. The house has been, built upon since then, and they say it's essentially like three little homes in one, the way it's constructed. So that is an interesting point. Jeff, to you, because this is also coming up.
Can I just say, what you just reminded me of something is, I would want to know the whole history of who had rented that house, who had lived there, because that might give some idea. Many of these offenders go back to a place where they feel very comfortable, or they've had some childhood memories or whatever. So that whoever owns the house might have a history of people who have, lived there before. That's the only thing I wanted to say.
And Jeff, from an investigative standpoint, I assume that they're doing that. They're going through the rent history on that home, looking at who the previous occupants are. Coupled with that, people get mad. I'll ask two questions in one. The other question that keeps coming up online from a lot of people, they're already calling this a cold case. When would this become a cold case? I spoke to one forensic expert who says they'll be on this very hotly and heavily for at least 2-3 years before it ever become a cold case. I'm curious about your take on that.
It's so let's address the first question. They're going to look at the history. They're going to be doing interviews with everyone. So yes, they're going to be interviewing every single friend, anyone who's ever been in that house since those students had moved in. They're going to want to get all kinds of information to put a big picture together, because right now, at least for us, we look at it, right, we're just seeing small tidbits coming out, and here's the thing: everyone wants to know everything. I understand that, but at the same point, when an investigation is going on, the law enforcement can't share a lot of information, because if they do, they can ruin the investigation. They can taint the investigation. So that's why, unfortunately, you have all your viewers and the people around the nation for every crime. We want to know more. We want to know more. That's human nature, right? But if they came out and started sharing too much, then we're going to get things that it could taint the investigation. So yes, they're going to be digging into every possible scenario that we can imagine to rule it out, keep that thread going. Now, if I remember correctly, the second investigation case, it will, to me, again, this is fresh, this is new. The fact that 4 young kids were killed in such a brutal manner in an area where they haven't experienced this before. There's going to be some significant investigative work done by everyone for quite some time. But if they don't get good leads initially, I would say the amount of people working on it is going to fall off, because we're going to have new crimes, new things that are going on, and you can't keep that dedicated resource forever. So, you look at the Boston Marathon bombing, for example. When we were there, the bombs go off, the first week and a half, 2 weeks, every FBI agent was stopped doing what they were doing and worked on that investigation. But after a week and a half to 2 weeks, we have other things that we have to do. And in this case, we were lucky. We had the younger brother in custody. We had the older brother died when his brother ran over him. So it was easy to start cutting people back to their cases. But that was a huge event. This is huge for that town, but the rest of Idaho, the state police that are dedicating resources, the FBI that are dedicating resources, the rest of any law enforcement agency that's dedicating resources to that town PD is going to say, I can't keep dedicating the amount of people we have right now, because we're covering the big leads now, and now they're getting smaller and smaller. So it's going to slow down, and it's unfortunate if that happens, but hopefully you have cases here where somebody says something to the wrong person. We see this with their gang cases. Somebody will mention it to a member, hey, I did this, and then that person can get it, and it's a lead, and it can start things up and keep things moving forward. So we just hope that as DNA comes back, you can develop possible suspects. Information about the car, the interviews with the 2 people in that car are the car or the one person in the car, if they can identify who was in that car, that can all help keep things going. It's just it's really it depends on how that information comes forward and how quick other crimes in the area start forcing resources to go back to dealing with other crimes to solve and prevent.
Gary,
Yeah.
these are very attractive young women and a man. Does that raise your intent at all that, to your point, maybe it's someone who's a scorned individual, someone that had a crush on one of the women, maybe is socially awkward, you know, some other issue. They feel like they were crossed and this is how they get their payback. Is that a possibility?
I think it's certainly a possibility, but you know, one point I think it would be good to raise is this. When we look at killers, this is true, serial killers especially, that are not overtly sexually motivated, or at least commit acts that might be seen as a sublimated kind of sexual act sometimes, like let's say Son of Sam, or some of these other. What's interesting about these people is that since it's ego that motivates them, it's ego that catches them. So that in other words, one of the things with that type, like for example, if you think about three, off the top of my head, three not overtly sexual serial killers that were on missions would be like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right? Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, and the Zodiac Killer, right? No rape, sexual assault, nothing. In all three cases, they wrote letters to the police, and or to people, that is to say, they wrote letters. Why? Because there was this kind of idea of toying intellectually with the idea, you can't catch me, you can't catch me, but also to convey what that ego needs to tell the world that they're feeling in the shadows. And the interesting thing about this type of person, if guy is anything like I think, is that half of the time, you have to imagine a person who half of the time feels like God and half of the time feels like nothing. Are they nothing or are they everything? That's the dilemma.
Yeah, it sounds like me a little bit, Gary.
So the point is, I feel like nothing, and then when I commit this deed, I'm everything. That's why it's interesting when killers like this do things like kill in the dark. Like the serial killer Robert Hansen that used to hunt women in the dark and shoot them in the back. If they turned around and saw him, he was just a small little nothing. But from behind them in the dark, he was everything. So that I think that this is the kind of person who, you know, assaults from the shadows and in the darkness, and because in that he's something bigger than himself. And so what I think is that these are the kind of people that sometimes get drawn out by police activity, by things that are published about them that are not true, by that kind of thing. The person can't tolerate not eventually popping up. And that's the same kind of people, like if you have some kind of public event, memorial event, some kind of thing where you ask the public their opinions on the case, they can't help it. They inveigle themselves in because they have to have complete control over the entire thing. They have to know everything that's going on. And also, and this I think gets right into the work that you did, the serial killer work, that these people with these kind of missions, they often visit the place and fixate on it and come near it over and over again to get that power, that sense of. So now I'm not saying this is a serial killer necessarily, but I think some of those features may be present here. What do you think about that, Ann?
Yeah, and you reminded me of something. I know that they're looking for, what they should be looking for in the residence is anything missing, because a lot of times they'll take a souvenir, and it might be something like just a driver's license that has the picture on it. So right. Those I'm hoping that they're looking for that. The problem is you have to have people that know what the victims had to know that if it was missing.
Right, like a hunter's trophy or something, yes, that this person. Yes, because I really think for this person, this day was like the way most of us would remember, like the day we got married or had kids or something. It was like the day they became themselves in their own eyes, you know, that kind of thing. So of course you'd expect a person like that to keep mementos and things. I mean, remember, about half of mass murderers commit suicide, and I always wondered why. Is it because when after they've emoted, they see themselves covered in blood and realize that they're probably going to go to jail or something, or they realize there are dead people around them and they have a moment of insight? You know, what is that about? Was that the plan from the beginning, an expression of annihilation or something? It's possible that we're also looking at somebody who committed suicide, but
Right.
that's much more common when the weapon used in a mass murder is a gun. When you use anything else, you're much less likely to kill yourself, even though the mental illness is more like the severe mental illness is more likely without the gun. So that's the other question is, what did the guy do to emote or express when the whole thing was over? Was it anticlimactic? Did he really? And what it sounds like is that this is a person who walked out of there probably covered in blood or went in with a change of clothes and probably drove out of there and went home and didn't seem to have any remorse or rethink it or do anything at all, but who was perfectly content with that. And so that gives you a little bit of a clue that this is not somebody who just popped and then went, what am I doing here? You know, right? So what did you say, Ann? It suggests a calculating, cold.
Very much so. And the other thing is he had so much time. They didn't discover the bodies until, what was it, almost noon the next day. So that's such a disadvantage for law enforcement, because he could have done so much, cleaned up, you know, made sure everything was as it should be. But I think the suicide thing is interesting.
Yeah. Also, I think the mode of weapon that Gary brings up is fascinating. That if it's a gun being used, the guy is more likely to, for lack of a better term, be a little bit more normal than if it's another weapon that you could read in to the mindset of the person. Another serial killer that comes to mind is Dennis Rader, BTK. He started killing in the early 70s, didn't get caught till he started contacting the media. He needed that attention. One thing I want to bring up with you, this is something that the Navy SEAL brought up, got a lot of attention online. He's also, as I said, a former FBI special agent. He looks at things like Jeff does as an investigator, former FBI, right? So he's looking at odd behavior, and the white guy in the hoodie that we can talk about in a few minutes, or the on again, off again boyfriend of Kaylee's, who they made 9 or 10 phone calls to in that window of time before the killings and after the killings. We can talk about that person, but Kaylee Goncalves' father, Stephen Goncalves, cannot seem to stay quiet. And that raised the antenna of this Navy SEAL and FBI special agent. And he's now hired his own attorney, his own investigator. He's revealing information that even the police aren't revealing. And when I had this Navy SEAL, Jonathan Gillum is his name, on the show, I happened to have a quote, a pretty lengthy quote from Steve Goncalves. And I read this quote that he issued to the media. And Jonathan stopped me after I read this quote, and I should have brought it. I didn't, my mistake. He said, you know what you just read? And I said, yeah, I read a quote from Steve Goncalves. He said, no, you didn't. You just read the movements of a killer, because it talked about how this person went in through the slider, went upstairs, went downstairs, went downstairs, went upstairs. So Jonathan is by no means saying the father is the killer. He says we've seen very crazy things in the past, and that family members are capable of killing family members. He just wants to make sure this person is ruled out. Ann, you're the woman. You've got the longest history. What is your reaction to that?
Well, it certainly is something that law enforcement usually looks at in a case, and Jeff can back me up on that, because especially when there's been the type of killing. But it would be why would he be a mass murderer? I could see one or two, maybe two, but I've never seen, well, I shouldn't say I've never seen, certainly you have mass murder family, somebody that will murder their whole family. And it is usually a lot of people. But given what I've seen coming from the media and his reporting, you'd have to rule out that he's just a frantic and a grieving father. It's his only child, if I remember correctly.
No, he has a daughter, but yeah.
He does have a daughter. Okay, so
another.
Yeah. But I'm not convinced. That's not convincing me to go down that avenue.
Jeff, your thoughts on that?
Well, it was funny because I remember when that quote was released in the news, and my fiance and I, she also spent 21 years like I did in the FBI, and
Oh.
she actually worked as the behavioral analysis coordinator for the Boston office, and we both kind of said that's very odd. So again, with Ann, I'm not saying, and the former agent you spoke to, not saying he's the person, but it's odd, and it would be something that we would in law enforcement take a long look at to rule out, to find out, because I find it hard to believe that law enforcement would share some of those details about what took place in the house with the family.
And Gary, you're again the psychologist. You deal mostly with the killer side of things, but there's no real way to know how a parent's going to react to the tragic murder of a daughter, right? I mean, could it just be that he's acting strange because of what just happened?
It's impossible to tell based on what's objectively observable here, because who knows the motives of the human heart, but when you're dealing with people that are not in that sort of rarer end of the spectrum of human behavior, that aren't psychopaths and sadists and things like that, usually the motives are things that, even if they're a little unusual, we can relate to them on some level. There's some human kind of something in there that would make sense if the person had an opportunity to explain it. But I don't think that's what we're dealing with the killer in this case. The killer in this case, I don't think too many of us would understand exactly what motivated this person. And because I can understand being upset because of envy or jealousy or something like that. But the difference is that you wouldn't, in the cold light of reason, after planning, perpetrate an act like that, unless on top of it was a grudge and a kind of a sense that all these people are lumped together, like you were going to war, like the way that the human brain can lump a whole group of people together as the enemy and kill any one of them because they happen to have a certain uniform on, is that kind of thing. And in that sense, I'm reminded, Jeff, of what we were talking about the idea of like sending a message to the rest of the gang. Because if you think about it, if this person is motivated in the way I think he is, then isn't part of the message to say, all these other women out there that are rejecting me better be scared too, because I'm lurking out there in the shadows. And now I have all of you in the palm of my hands because I'm slithering like a serpent right underneath your feet. I could be your friend. I could be the guy that's in the grocery store. I could be the guy around the corner. So that I think this type of killer loves that feeling that they could strike like lightning, out of nowhere. And you get the whole community terrified. And you saw that with all those killers I mentioned that have that ego motivation. And wouldn't you say, Jeff, there's that quality of like, it's like a code. Like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Be afraid, all women. Right.
I'm here.
Yeah.
I can do what I want when I want.
Yeah.
The sick mind of a serial killer. So there's two other people that we need to discuss quickly. And then with your permission, I'd love to take some viewer comments. We get a lot of them for you guys to respond to. So the other one is Jack Showalter. He's the guy in the so-called white hoodie you see. Apparently he had some behavioral problems. He was thrown out of a fraternity. He's, from what anyone can ascertain, someone investigators would have to be looking at. There's also, apparently he drove for 5 hours back to his parents' home. I got a comment the other day from someone who says it's easy to refute, confirm with GPS, tower pings, phone receipts, cameras, etc. He said he wasn't involved. I mean, Jeff, what about the use of technology to rule out suspects? It should be fairly easy, right?
It can be. It's definitely something that is very useful to our investigations. It can rule people out, but a lot of times, it can be spoofed, right? If I could leave a phone somewhere, or I could say, hey, have a friend, hey, you need to borrow a phone, or there's ways around it. But yes, if I keep my phone on, I don't have it in airplane mode, or I don't have it turned off, you're going to be able to track that phone every time it hits new cell tower. So law enforcement has those abilities to track phones, cell towers, GPS. You get in a car, a lot of cars now have those GPSs already built in, so you can get that and see it. So obviously the technology out there today can be both a hindrance and positive for law enforcement investigations.
And Ann, I'm wondering your thoughts on this fella, this Jack Showalter, the guy in the so-called white hoodie. There's video. Apparently, he's staring at the young women. There's some, nonverbal cues going on. I'm curious if you saw that video and what you think of this person. He comes from privilege, the child of 2 doctors. They say he might be in Africa right now. Curious what you think of him from a profiler perspective.
It's not to Gary, to me.
To you, yes.
Oh, to me. Well, he certainly's got to be kept on the radar, from what you described. And he literally he's out of the country already.
They say he's in Africa. I don't think that's been corroborated. His parents are both doctors, and apparently they travel to Africa. So I have not heard one way or the other. If someone watching can let us know, I'd appreciate it. Whether that is true or not, but I think it's someone that they're definitely looking at.
Right. And I think that given what Gary went into, some of the odd kind of behaviors that to watch for, I would just say he's got to be kept on the list. Absolutely.
And Gary, to you, there's another guy, Jack DeCour. He's like the on and off boyfriend. They have phone calls throughout the night prior to the murder, and I think he calls after the murder. What kind of motivation is it for a person if they're an on again, off again boyfriend? Do you read anything into that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think the smartest thing for all of us to do would probably not speculate about any particular named person at this time. But what I will say is that my sense, based on my experience of this type of offender, is that he or someone like you just described becomes less interesting to me because this is somebody who has been in a relationship. What I envision is somebody who would have been much more failed at attempting to have normal, predictable human relationships, with someone who may not have ever been intimate with somebody who has the pathetic substitute of violence as an outlet for, this desire to connect in some strange way to a human being and control them. And so that, this whole idea of this is motivated by, someone is jealous or someone, I mean, it just doesn't match what now, are there are there mass murders that are motivated by being jilted romantically? Yes, actually very commonly so. So, it's not impossible as a motive here. But I just think that there are characteristics here that suggest a different type of person. And but I don't know. I think the jury is out right now. We're really operating in the dark.
It's funny. I am, for full disclosure, the son of a psychiatrist and the son of a social worker. And my father, I know, would say we have no idea who the killer is till we know who the killer is. That's what he would say. I'm 100% certain of it. Jeff, this one's for you here. This is we'll go through some comments if you guys are cool with it. This is from, not only is it for you for content purposes, but it's a real Boston name. Mickey O'Shea writes, I think people are too confident that DNA was left at the scene just due to whether the killer or killers likely wore long sleeves, possibly gloves. Being able to scratch a face if uncovered when the killer has a knife is not a given. I think there's a chance that there's no DNA left, at least none that can be explained away by it being a party house where numerous people visited. Also, triangulation of phone pings on towers may not be able to place anyone more nearby the house, and it's likely the killer or killers did not bring a phone. Your response?
It could be. Again, this is something we don't know. We're not the investigators. We're not in the house to see. Right? What did the subject wear in there? We don't know. Did he have gloves? Was he wearing long clothes? Did he have a hat on to make sure his any hair? Did he have long hair, short hair? If anyone was able to fight back, if I have a knife, yeah, they would be close enough that yes, I could possibly scratch somebody. Again, you're the one comment like, oh, if you're being stabbed, it's unlikely to get DNA. I mean, if I'm in that close enough, my range is there where I'm stabbing. The person being stabbed has something able to. The question is, what was that person able to grab and able to get any DNA under his or her fingernails? You know, it's the three girls, the one guy. Were they able to do anything where there was a transfer of DNA? We don't have that information, but it could be there. How long did the suspect remain in the house after killing these college students? Again, we don't know, because the bodies weren't found until the roommates woke up and found everything, and it was hours. We don't know, and that's what makes it so difficult here. In since we don't know, it's hard for us to really profile everything here without that knowledge. So there's just so much there. But phones, if somebody brought their phone in, yeah, you could start pinging it. It won't be able to put somebody, yes, that person was in the house, but the triangulation would put them in the vicinity. So it could be something you could start doing to try and narrow an owner of a phone down.
And Ann, the Navy SEAL we had on, he gets into the details, stuff that I would never think of, but he says he believes that these people were mounted when stabbed to death. I assume that, and would an autopsy reveal that? Would that say something one way or the other about the profile of the killer, as opposed to stabbing them while standing up or mounting them? What does that tell you?
They should, that may well be able to tell from the angle that the wound is and how it went in. Again, if it's not a lot, if these wounds run together, that's what we're really waiting to see, because you've really had two different divergent opinions. One is there was a lot of blood around, and others where there wasn't. I mean, if these young people went in to find them at noon that next morning and they had to call other people because they thought they were unconscious, it couldn't have been a lot of blood. I mean, I would have thought they would have been horrified initially and called, more than just other friends. So again, that's going to come, and sounds like that was the second floor. The third floor, we've talked about that, seems to be where certainly the Kaylee was and so forth. But I think autopsy is going to tell us a number of things. Absolutely.
Back to the Goncalveses for a minute, and I definitely don't want to pick on them, but this is stuff that other viewers picked up. This person whose name I cut off says, and Gary, I'd love your take on this. I know you don't want to speculate, and I absolutely respect that, but this commenter says the sister of Kaylee in her first interview and the affect of her father all along have been very odd to me. The words they would say right at the beginning about the gory specifics of the crime with zero emotion, I could not relate. I've been trying to chalk it all up to potentially them being on medication, ? That all being said, I agree with Jonathan, who is our guest, that you cannot rule anyone or anything out at this point. Your thoughts?
Well, look, again, let's be careful here. But what I will say is, in general terms, is that there have been cases that I've looked at, read about, where people are traumatized and the trauma limits their effective expression. It's a common, it's a DSM, kind of diagnostic feature of PTSD or trauma, that there's a kind of flattening of the emotional experience and numbing, so that you can't read into that. I think it's important not to do that. I mean, from a mental health perspective, the danger of doing that is interpreting somebody who might be traumatized or experiencing something in a painful way as being involved in some way in it. And that's something I think we should be very careful not to do until all the details of this case have emerged.
100%.
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
After 9/11, I spoke to a lot of the family members. One of my initial jobs after 9/11 was to interview the people who dropped off their loved ones that got onto the flights in Boston and flew out of Boston. Mm-hmm. Gary's absolutely right. you just lost your daughter, your son. Parents are not, parents expect their kids to outlive them. So to say that, we can see how they're going to react. Everyone reacts differently to that stress. Everyone reacts differently to that trauma. So Gary's completely right. And we can't automatically assume that people are going to act like we would think we'd act, right? And that's the situation here. And
I think one of the
emotions of people I interviewed. So I completely agree with what Gary's saying.
I think one of the things that kind of raised a lot of people's radar with respect to the Goncalves family is that Stephen Goncalves's brother is serving a sentence for murder. And so his name is Nathan Goncalves. And it was a recent murder. And I don't know. So maybe people are, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But we got another comment here from Amelia. And this one, Ann, I'll throw to you. She says, I agree that the killer had to mount these victims to stab them, but has anyone also considered that there were two bad actors with same type weapons and same type shoes? It was bold to enter a home with 6 individuals in there, risking that they might all wake up and see them. Even if the killer or killers killed some, they couldn't kill all 6 at once, and one of them would have gotten away. I still think there were 2. Ann?
Well, yeah, and that's not an uncommon response. We heard that initially. You're always never wanted to just say it was one, and that certainly theoretically you could have one going on one floor and one going on another floor. I suppose that it wouldn't have to even be one person that did all 4. So I think that's now this is where the DNA may help if they can get it, if there isn't too much merging of the samples, where they would see enough different ones, all obviously different from the victims. So I'm not ruling that out.
Although I have two comments I would add there.
Okay.
One is that when we looked at mass murder in the database, you could count on a couple of hands the number of mass murders that were committed by a team, unless it was as part of a criminal enterprise or a gang enterprise. Very unusual for a person to commit mass murder with a partner. And again, you get right back to that point that would imply the ability to form an even perverse allegiance or alliance between 2 people that would imply a friendship or connectivity or intimacy. And these qualities that were glimpsed in this crime are a person who was not capable of forming those kinds of bonds. So that from a psychological perspective, I'm inclined to think this was a lone wolf. That's the whole point of what I think motivated this. If they could form an allegiance, I'm not so sure they'd be that angry. So that you see, but Ann, I think Ann is right to say, technically, we don't know. The jury is out. I mean, because there are also anomaly cases that come up that take all this stuff and blow it out of the water. Because right back to the point I was making in the beginning, there are lots of new types of things happening that are setting new precedents, so that it may simply be that this is just such a modern crime that it has very little precedent in history.
Gary, what factor does social media technology play into this so-called new violence? That's got to be a huge factor.
Well, it is a form of technology that permits types of crime to occur that are either new or are new forms of old cruelty.
Let me ask you, what is
assaults, etc. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You said that things have really changed since the 1960s as it relates to. So what is it that has changed, at its core?
Well, there are 2 things, and I want to be careful not to make sweeping generalizations here, but there are 2 things that are very notable when you sort of get into the study of crime, right? One has a lot to do with the rights that women obtained in the 1960s onward, because in certain brittle working class men, that was seen as an offense, so that you start to see an explosion of serial sexual homicide and aggression towards women that seems to come right at the tail end of that liberation process. And it is, in fact, what motivated the FBI to connect with Ann, right? Is that they wanted to know, why was all of this new type of serial killing happening? We assume there's always been lust murder across history, and there have, but you could count on a couple of hands the number of times it happened. After the 1960s, serial killing was most commonly motivated by sexual aggression. That's a much newer phenomenon as the kind of pandemic, the pandemic, kind of type of serial killing from the 1960s, particularly to the 1990s. And the second thing has to do with this, and it gets into a philosophical thing, but it's important. Whatever one believes about religion, culture, modes of thought, whatever, they have a way of gluing the identity together and giving one a sense of purpose and boundaries and inhibition. And what happens to a culture when you take them away and you let people have a lot more grayness is that you start to see an existential void where people have no sense of why they exist apart from something that they're doing, like the person they're dating, the job they have, the school they go to, the character they are on social media, whatever. And what happens is, in mass murder especially, is that when that thing is taken from them, they explode. That when you study mass murder, you see that it's all about, what was that thing that you were deprived of, right? Did some political figure you venerate, fall from grace, and now you don't have them to identify with anymore? Did you lose your wife? Did you lose your husband? Did you lose your scholarship? Did you lose your... So that's a common trigger in that type of individual, the mass murderer, who then is so enraged and so jealous and so envious that they will go out and take it away from everybody else. But so you want to understand that thing of that kind of taking away of boundaries has had a very enormous effect on personality structure and the average individual. So that what you actually start to see is that the culture can become more narcissistic and unboundaried and disinhibited. And then that paves the way, in conjunction with new technology, for all kinds of growing new awful types of crime. And you know that it's cultural because it doesn't happen in every country to the same degree. I mean, a lot of this is decidedly American phenomenon. So that, we have to ask ourselves, what is going on in the collective pot we share that is heating us all up like this? And but I think that, in my mind, this killing has a very modern flavor to it.
So interesting. Jeff, the authorities in Moscow started to give back items to family members yesterday. Too premature? Some people say it's too premature. What do you think from an investigative standpoint?
If there's no evidentiary value to something, there's no need to keep it. I can tell you there's plenty of times where you collect stuff and then also now we're responsible for it. If I don't need it, I'm going to get it back to them right away. So I wouldn't say we should read too much into it. I would also go back to the comment I just wanted to add. I think it was Amelia, you mentioned saying there could be two. She couldn't see this being done by one. I'm not going to necessarily...
Hey, Jeff, hold that thought for 1 second, because Gary says he's got to roll out. Gary, it was an absolute pleasure. He's a co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. Gary, I hope you come back on. Your insight was fascinating. You are the voice of reason. Thank you.
Well, and listen, Jeff and Ann are as good as it gets, so you're in great hands there. Okay.
Thank you. Won't keep them long. So, Jeff, sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say one thing. I help teach with Ann, and I've taught at high schools, and I've heard a lot of questions to that. And the one thing I always say is, you're thinking like a normal human being, and you're looking at it as you look at it. We can't look at this person as we are. This is a criminal. This is someone who, it could be two, but 4 people are now dead. And you can't look at through your eyes. You've got to start looking at through their eyes and what they're trying to think. And that's when it comes to working the gang cases, people say, I just can't believe that the gang members will do it. Well, yes, they do it because they don't have the same thoughts that we do, where we're law-abiding citizens. they are career criminals and this is their life. And this person is now, if he hasn't already done so, or she, if it was a woman, it looks more like a man to me, just because the violence, the knife, to be able to do it to 4 people, you know, leads more to being a man. But you can't put the way you would do something, you have to look at it the way that person would do something.
And is there any chance this is not a male suspect?
I don't think there's any chance there's not a male suspect. There is a male suspect. I will profile that. I agree with Jeff. It's a male.
I'd be shocked if it wasn't. So, Jeff,
Right.
we'll get through this. I know you guys have a life outside of Surviving the Survivor. This comment, though, Jeff, comes from Earth Minus. I watched this video, and in the background, they're talking about body cam footage from one of the officers. And in the background from the policeman's body camera at 3:01 a.m., you can literally see in the distance the light on in the middle window upstairs. It's on, and you can literally see it be turned off. I watched this in slow motion. Those girls shut the light off for the last time. Watch it. I think it's Bed Crime Stories that did it. That's another YouTube channel. Again, I mean, how important is this body cam footage? Cops also stopped a couple of like rowdy, I think they were drunk college students, a pair of college students, right around the time the murder was happening, and you can see the house practically in the distance. How important is that body cam footage? What do they do with it right now? I mean, do they go frame by frame? How do they approach that?
Oh yeah, they'll definitely review the body camera footage. That's important footage to look at. Maybe it picks something up, but you got to remember, how far away are they from here? Could you know, we all know that people have been out, they've been going to bars, going out to eat, they're home now, they're getting ready for bed. We can't just say the light turns off and it's hard to say that. But if they're a couple hundred yards away, yeah, we see the light go off. I haven't seen the video, but the light goes off. But how you know, that body camera, it's here. Is it meant to pick up details 200 yards away? No, it's meant to show what the police officer's showing, what the police officer's doing, what the person that police officer's interacting with. So it's not going to pick up great stuff. Could it pick something up if they're closer? It could be, and it could lead them into a direction that could help them develop new leads and help solve something. But they will do it with their computer and really sit down.
Next comment for you, Ann, from Carol Abrego. Hi, enjoy the show. Your mother, this one here, is adorable. This is the second show I've seen so far. Kaylee had just purchased a new vehicle. Is it a possibility that someone at the car dealership became fixated on her? She's a beautiful girl. She would have given all her information to someone in the finance department. No doubt they would have detailed information and clean the vehicle for her. Maybe someone from housekeeping noticed her on the way to the powder room. I do believe this case will be solved by modern day science and technology. Your reaction to that, Ann?
Oh, I think that's really important. That's someone that's really paying attention, and it should be checked out. There could be something like Jeff just said, that might be one little thing that is noticed, and that can be enlarged. I say go for it.
And another one for you, and Jeff can follow up on this. And this is from Town Trekker. Another great interview. I've wondered for days, why did the perp stop? Why kill 4 and leave 2? Did something scare them? Did they cut their hand? If so, could there be blood drops like a trail that could be tracked? Why did the perp stop, Ann?
Right. Well, one of the things that was Gary had mentioned is sending a message. But my question had been, can you get to the first or that floor from the second floor or the third floor? I mean, you got, if indeed they, as it said in the media, that they go second floor and then third floor, well, then they have to retrace their tracks, I guess, to come down. And then do they go, obviously they didn't come in the ground floor. They came in the other,
all the reports, sorry to interrupt, but all the reports I've read, and even Stephen Gonzalez said this. This is the comment that he mentioned where the former FBI agent said that he was basically talking about the steps of the killer. They say he did come in through the second floor slider, which is on the back side of the house. And I'm not sure if the basement is connected, but all that's really important.
It's very important. And the other thing I think I read is that one of those on that first floor had opened the door, heard something outside, had opened, seen a male figure. She thought, shut the door and locked it. Now, it was written somewhere, so that would need to somehow go into the mix. Look at.
And there's also reports now that after the whoever the criminal was, the front door was left open. And it was left open, and I think it was like 28-degree weather. What if anything does that tell you, Jeff? Someone left in a hurry, maybe?
So, I mean, that's definitely a possibility. Could it also be, was it not just in blew open? Who knows? But it's something that, as an investigator, I would look at. I would try and figure out, why is this door open? I know when I was in college back in the 80s, I didn't necessarily lock my apartment door. I lived on the third floor of a house. You open the door up the stairs, and I never locked the door. My roommates never locked the door unless we were all out, right? When we were in the house, you had 4 Army guys living in a house. We weren't afraid of anyone coming in per se, right? So it could be very easy to have that door left open, or someone could come in through the door and leave it open. I mean, who knows? It's just, there's so many things here that you can't, it's hard to speculate, and not being there, not being a part of the investigation. It's hard to answer that specific question like that.
Couple more and we'll be done. So this one comes from Perfectly Imperfect. Last night there was a sense, at least online, that things were happening. They announced this Hyundai Elantra that they're looking for, and then someone was arrested in a different part of the state who looked similar to a description that someone had given. And then on top of that, a peeping Tom, this is the comment, a peeping Tom, and Jeff, we'll go to you first on this one. A peeping Tom was arrested yesterday approximately 1.2 miles from the scene. He has a murder conviction from 2007. I'm not sure why he'd be out then. He also has a large bandage on his arm. Interesting. I don't know if you saw the photo of this guy, but he's kind of unkempt looking. Looks like he had a real long night. He's arrested, and he's got this giant blue or green bandage on his forearm. I assume right now that anyone who's caught doing anything inappropriate, especially a peeping Tom, they're really, on a typical day, they might just be like, whatever, this guy is, whatever. But now they've got to really home in on these guys, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I would definitely want to talk to that guy and show me what's underneath that bandage, what's going on. Just because, again, you're up close and personal when you're stabbing someone, and it is a knife. Blood's going places, things get slippery. He could cut himself on that knife. He could suffer some kind of wounds or injuries. And if you're a peeping Tom, why wouldn't you talk? Maybe he was peeping somewhere nearby and saw something, is afraid to say anything because he's got that murder conviction, because he's a peeping Tom. Well, why were you there? He could be completely innocent of this crime, but maybe he saw something, and that's going to scare people. I mean, again, you have a lot of people who are willing to provide information to the law enforcement, but other times you don't. I mean, for example, it's easy for me to go back to this one because it's fresh in my mind. But after the Boston Marathon bombing, when the photographs of the 2 suspects were released, we did not get a single call identifying them until 30 minutes after we identified. The law enforcement identified them, and then the first call 30 minutes later came in saying, "Oh, you need to look at these 2 guys. That's who it is." And that was 7.5 to 8 hours after the press conference where the photographs were released. So, there's a lot of different things that go on in this case.
I had the misfortune, I guess, to cover that. I was up in Boston for a week. I remember people are so jittery at the beginning of a crime, especially one like the Boston Marathon bombing. My photographer and I set up on a corner, and I look up on the telephone and I saw this black receiver with an antenna. And I was like, John, what do we do? Do we say something? Do we call? Luckily, there were some police nearby. They took it super seriously. Boston PD brought in some team, climbed up there. Turned out it was a receiver for a cell phone, but it looked just like what you'd use in a bombing, and they were really grateful. So all these tips happen. And along those lines, we've got one last comment and we'll wrap it up. For a while now, a student's mother has been saying that her son texted with Ethan, that's Ethan Chapin, near 2 a.m. And from Ethan's reply, the son is sure he was still at the party around 2 a.m. Cops were then wrong when they kept their original timeline, saying all four were home at 1:45 a.m. 24 hours after the bodies were found, one victim's sister, I think it was Kaylee, verified the police timeline was wrong. It goes on and on and on. But there is this question of this timeline of the other two, of Xana and Ethan. And this person is saying that they were at the fraternity house at 2. Police are saying they were home by 1:45. Jeff, you're the investigator. Does that raise alarm bells? And then we'll end up with Ann.
I don't necessarily know it raises alarm bells. I always used approximately for everything I did, approximately at this time. It's hard to say. All I know is that, yeah, could it be wrong? It could be. But could they be wrong? Yes, they could. The police aren't going to release everything they have. They can't. And because of that, we're just going to go, I'm going to go with their timeline until I have absolute direct evidence of, yes, we've pinged the phone. But they've got their timeline, they're working it. And if they may have their own changes, but to them, it's not important enough to constantly release to the public because they have so much going on and they just can't keep replying to every little request coming in for information because they're trying to solve this crime. They're trying to catch the person responsible. And that's their main goal.
And Ann, you are the legend when it comes to this kind of crime. What is next and what are your final thoughts on where we stand right now?
Well, I was just going to comment that if the house was under surveillance by the killer and he sees the Ethan and the girl Xana go in last, that might have meant something to him. He might have waited, then gone in. How does he get in? Those kinds of things. So I do think that is important to try to see what it means in that he's the killer went to his floor first. He would be the greatest threat. We know that in a multiple victim that they go after the greatest threat first, which makes sense. So that may all fit in there if you have somebody that's there watching and surveilling the house, or maybe even in the house, who knows? So that would just be my comment on that. And then what's next? I think that just have to get the information out that people can help with. I think a lot of people like Jeff and Gary are willing to help with whatever evidence comes forward. And I think this has captured everybody's attention, and we all should work as we can to try. There are 4 victims. And I would say there's another victim in a different respect, and that's a school. The University of Idaho has taken a terrible lost 4 of their students, but it has an effect on them. And not only the community, but the university. So my being in a university, I know what this would mean if, it happened, anything that happens on our campus, it can be a very, minor kind of a thing. So I think we should keep that in mind too.
And I think that's an amazing point, not to mention Washington State University is just 8 miles away. So you've got these 2 really big university towns. Moscow is only a town of 26,000 people. Their lives have been turned upside down. If you don't know who she is, you better Google Ann Burgess. You've all got the Google. She's wrote and is the author of several books. The latest, A Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Gary, who had to jump off to go grab dinner, I bet, is the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. And then we've got Jeff Wood. Correct, Jeff? I've got that
That's
right?
correct.
Jeff
Yes,
came on super late, so I apologize. Jeff is writing his book, I bet, right, Jeff? I hear you're working on a book.
I am. Yes.
Awesome. And I hope that you'll come back with your fiance, because she was in the FBI and is a behavioral specialist, correct?
She did have that specialty. Yes.
Awesome. So thanks to one and all. Really appreciate it. Love you, America.